Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Pioneering Pensions. For you who don't know me, my name is Stefan Lundberg, and I have a passion for pensions. And today we have a very special guest here, and we do it differently from our studio here in London. We're going to meet with Amlan Roy. Welcome, Amlan.
It's a pleasure to be here, Stefan. Hope I'm audible to everyone in your audience. And I wouldn't be here except for you. I'm a little bit health challenged today, so I tell the audience, bear with me. But it's a pleasure to be with one of the leading experts on global pensions in the world today, Stefan, and with Cardano, who I've known since ever since they were set up. So let's hope for an interesting session.
Thank you, Amlan. And as usual, we're going to have a conversation for half an hour. After that, the floor is open so you can ask Amlan your questions about today's topic, which is demographics. And when you're thinking about that, demographics is a massive thing happening. And in your latest book, Amlan, which is called Demographics Unraveled, you quote Peter Drucker, and he said that demographics is the single most important factor that nobody pays attention to. And when they do pay attention, they miss the point. So, Amlan, what is the point?
Thank you, Stefan, again for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Let me show a copy of my book. It's called Demographics Unraveled. It was written towards the end of 2021, and it covers a whole host of areas which link macroeconomics, finance, and actuarial science. But let's get to Peter Drucker, one of my all-time heroes. Peter Drucker was called by Keith Ambakshir as the guru of all pensions gurus. Peter Drucker was also called by Harvard Business School faculty one of the biggest management gurus of last 2 centuries. And Peter Drucker did predict that DB pensions would fail. But in a book called Management Challenges for the 21st Century, Peter Drucker said most people missed the point. And over the 22 years that I've traveled the world presenting on pensions across 43 countries, nearly everyone seems to have missed the point, including me when I was an academic, because to me, demographics used to be largely about age, about numbers of people, about longevity. But when I look at the origin of the word demographics, it comes from demos, which is people, graphos, which is characteristics. And the most important characteristics to me as a macroeconomist is that of people as consumers and workers. Nowhere in the definition of people characteristics is age the only one. I agree age is important, but it is not a summary statistic for all people characteristics. So let's look at a very important example. I wrote a paper where we showed the 5 oldest countries in the world are very similar in terms of age, but very dissimilar in terms of pensions, health, consumerism, as well as labor markets. And those 5 oldest countries in the world are Germany, Greece, Italy, Sweden, and Japan. And I had the fortune of presenting it to the Japanese Prime Minister's group in Japan in 2012. So I would like to highlight that demographics is about consumers and workers, and therefore it affects 8.1 billion people who are consumers. A baby born in Great Ormond Street Hospital right now is a consumer. So is the oldest woman in Okinawa, Japan, aged 114 years. They are consuming two different things. And 5.5 billion of us in the world who are workers are affected by demographics. Workers create the GDP of the world, and consumers consume roughly 70% of the GDP of the world. So I contradict three things that people get wrong. Number one, demographics is about age alone. Wrong. Number two, demographics is about counting the number of people. If counting the number of people was the answer, then China and India about 10 years ago would have already been much greater powers than they are. They are young, but just being young does not guarantee you the demographic dividend, as I will talk about later. You need much more than people and young people for countries to grow, for there to be prosperity, for there to be human rights, for there to be climate change and things like that. The third thing which is different is demographics affects profit and loss of every company, every country, every household, because consumers are revenue sources and workers are costs. So for any company, let's take Marriott, let's take Credit Suisse, let's take State Street, and let's take Cardano. Consumers get in revenues and workers are costs. So revenues minus cost affect the income statement and P&L of every country, every household, and every company. So we need to look at demographics as affecting every economic fundamental. I will argue later, GDP, inflation, current account, etc. And thereby it also affects asset prices, which are dependent on those macro factors.
Thank you, Amlan. And before we jump into that, I was thinking historically, when we think about demographic, we think it's like a pyramid, like a lot of young people and then fewer old and very few really old people. And what we start to see now is that it starts to look more like a barrel shape rather than a pyramid. And if you look at the projections going forward, we're going to see more like an inverse pyramid. So I say, I assume it's different between countries because not everybody is in the same sort of space. But what is different between different currencies and regions? If you would sort of give us an overview.
Yeah. So if we look historically at the genesis of pensions, the first pension system was designed by Otto von Bismarck in 1892 in Germany. At that time, life expectancy was only 46 years old, and he came up with the retirement age of 65 in answer to the following question: at what age does it become unsafe for a German train driver to drive a train? And why a German train driver? Because the railway industry was the most prominent industry that time, and Germany one of the major powers in the world. At that time, most people didn't live till 65. And the typical Christmas trees, or what we call population pyramids, showing the age structure, were very relevant when countries like US, UK, and developed countries in Nordic Australia were growing in the 50s and 60s. As countries started aging and having fewer children, the population pyramids rectangularized, and then some of them have started looking inverse. If you have too many old people to be supported by fewer people, that raises fiscal sustainability problems. The origins of pay-as-you-go system were too many young people putting into the system and too few young people, old people to be supported. Now we've got the reverse. We've got very many old people living into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100s to be supported by a shrinking mass of young people because of two reasons. People living longer, way beyond 65. Earlier retirement ages were 65. And in the demographic manifesto, which more than 40 governments have read and adopted in different ways, in 2000, we suggested abolishing the mandatory retirement age of 65 and having flexible, enabled retirement ages, which is what a lot of governments in Nordic land, in Australia, etc., are doing. Let's link retirement ages to life expectancy. So population pyramids, if you look, they look very much like pyramids in Africa and Afghanistan and in countries with high fertility rates, which are like 6, 7 children per woman. Yet when you go down to countries like Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, and even Japan or Spain and Portugal, low fertility rates of 1.2, 1.3 children per woman are leading to inversion of the population pyramid, which poses fiscal sustainability questions. And a big question raised by an IMF population pensions expert, Peter Heller, in early 2000s was, who will pay? And that is the $64 billion question that you and I are trying to sort when we look at DB, and hybrid schemes for the rest of the world.
I fully agree. That's the biggest challenge. How do you sort the financing of a larger portion of retiring people going to be supported by fewer younger people? But also when you think if people are living longer, you might say, well, just work longer then because then the problem is solved. I think that's how the Dutch government viewed it. But you can also then ask yourself, how is your healthy longevity? Are we living longer at good health or are we just living longer?
Great question, Stefan, because healthy, and that's why in my book I highlight the difference between life expectancy at birth, which is what most people focus on, very different. We should focus on life expectancy at 65, 70, 75, 80. That's called conditional life expectancy. Then further in the old age life expectancy, we should ask the question, are these old people healthy? Are they like the Finns and the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians, healthy, or as in some parts of Japan, healthy and not a drain on society? If healthy life expectancy is there, then that is very good. But if people are going to be suffering from lung disease or other kinds of problems, that could be a drain on resources. And what affects the population pyramids greatly is immigration. And I do highlight in my book, as well as in many lectures, that Germany would be shrinking in population terms from 1974 if they didn't take in immigrants. And countries which are similar in immigration patterns, where 40 to 50% of the natural population change comes from immigration, are countries such as US, Canada, Australia, UK, France, and that's where immigration is roughly 40% of the total population change. 60% comes from births minus deaths. In Germany, births minus deaths were going negative in 1973, and immigration helped it be positive. So we really need to think about the role of immigration. And during the COVID period, the Australian and Canadian government said that thanks to blocks on immigration, their GDP growth went down by 0.6% and 0.75%. And I also argued at the central banks of Austria, as well as the Central Bank of Czech Republic, in February of 2020, way before COVID really hit the rest of the world. It was prevalent in China, that if COVID was going to spread, we needed global solutions, and this would cause emerging markets, thanks to informal labor markets, close to 7 to 10% of declines in GDP and per capita GDP, because they have informal labor markets which take very long to recover. I'm very happy to say that later the IMF came and also said the same thing. So I do think it is quite important to look at life expectancy in terms of conditional life expectancy, and there monitoring this together, because morbidity means that the causes of death can be very different. In my book, I show that the top 10 leading causes of death in 1970, 80, 90, and 2000 were very different, and it's changing towards three, four very important causes being causes of death, which is Alzheimer's, Parkinson, dementia, and those mental related illnesses, many of those for whom we do not have solutions. So we really need to be aware of it. And you've made a very good point. If you, and this is what we meant by flexible, enabled retirement, people should work part time, part year, part week. We advised the Japanese, German, Swiss governments in 2000. And now we see whether it's Toyota, whether it's Honda, whether it's Swiss Life, that's happening part time, part year, part week, and people are working longer. But that happens more for white collared workers, much harder for blue collared workers to do that. And therefore, in countries like Singapore and few other countries, they are retraining the manufacturing workers in their 50s so that they do not land up short of a job in the 60s and can find a transition to a new career. So it's important to remember in mind that if you live longer, keep yourself healthy, health is wealth, and then you be prepared to work longer. It's not just me saying it. In 2000 to 2006, OECD published 43 pamphlets, one for each country: live longer, work longer. But I will also add one more bit to it, which they have not added and which they are wrong on: live longer, work longer, learn longer. If you keep yourself active learning new things, then you can find a new job. So if I learn new things and I am 70, then maybe I can appeal to Emmanuel or Jenny out here, and they'll say, I still have some skills which make me relevant for a job, and I'm not totally fossilized in terms of my skill set.
And I think this is a very nice thought that led me to the documentary that Cardano made and Theo Cocken made, Your 100-Year Life, which is about how do you transition yourself through the different stages of life as you're getting older. And probably also good to think about how to deal with healthcare so you can get older people to stay healthier longer and keep them in the workforce, because that's also a way to solve the economic challenges we're going to face with the aging population. Let's turn into what the impact aging has on economics. And you could say that we did have sort of economic dividend, as you said, in the early years when you have a lot of young people. And now we probably have a sort of demographic debt, rather, we need to deal with. So where are we in the different countries? Let's focus on Europe first, because that's sort of, every region is different. Can you sort of talk us through that?
So First, let me tell you, in geography and in demographics, there's a theory of demographic transition. The oldest of countries, Italy, Germany, Japan, are in stage 5, very advanced staging. Then in stage 4, you might find countries such as Canada, US, etc. Stage 3, you'll find countries like India. In stage 4 and stage 5, there's a very, very important thing to remember. As people age, but they are richer, many find that they still need to come back and re-engage in the workforce in Japan, because they find that giving back to society and keeping yourselves engaged keeps Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and
Mm.
dementia at bay. So I'll give you an example of a very, very big top 10 Japanese company name I've been told not to mention, which over the last 15 years has brought back people above 65 and given them the following proposition: work for us 2 days a week, okay, or work for us 10 days in a month. You will get roughly 34% of what you were getting earlier in terms of your wages, but you will get health insurance. And workers are coming back to share their knowledge
Mm.
with younger workers and telling them about problems that they found. And that is a win win, because generations collaborate, they build good networks, and also it gives them a fulfillment of giving back to their own company, because their own company feels that McKinsey consultants and others who are external don't have the internal history of being able to
Mm.
share the learning mechanisms, which are very, very internal culturally to those companies. So that is happening in Japan, it's happening in Switzerland, it's happening in other countries of the world. It's also happening in some younger countries of the world. I'll give you examples of India and Malaysia, where people are brought into advisory boards. They retire, but they still continue as
Mm.
advisors of their competing companies or some industry association, etc. It keeps them engaged, but allows them to share the knowledge. We would be giving up on an older population if we did not tap into the skills that they have in their 50s and 60s. And the ageism that people talk about is something that is there, but older people have to look after themselves, make ourselves relevant to society, and show that we can work in society. So the demographic dividend, most people get this wrong, and I would like the audience to pay attention, because I'm known for calling out 500 out of 500 people in Japan and US, and no one defined demographic dividend correctly, including politicians. Demographic dividend is the contribution that demographics has to GDP per capita growth. Most people think it's GDP growth,
Mm.
and GDP per capita growth is very different than GDP growth. So let's take an example to define this. If India and China both grow at 8%, which is a possibility at some point, people think, or even at 7%, India's GDP per capita growth will be less than half of China's, because India's population growth rate is more than double of China. So you have to keep into account GDP growth as well as population growth, which takes me to a brilliant framework on GDP growth and demographics that ECB developed, but I've popularized in 70 plus countries around the world. It says if you want to understand GDP growth, you need to get three building blocks. Number one, working age population growth. So in working age population could be 20 to 69, could be 24 to 74 if you're studying in Sweden or Finland. Uh, and the working age population growth is the number one component. Is that growing? Do you have more people in that age? Number two is labor productivity growth, which means do I flip more burgers this year relative to last year? Remember, these are growth this year relative to last year. Do I write more papers? Do you do more conferences? Do you do more interviews? Does somebody bring in more revenues? So that is productivity growth. And the third component is labor utilization growth, which has to do with hours worked. Most people are already working long hours, so that isn't increasing. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, developed countries saw very high GDP growth because of two components: labor productivity growth, which used innovation, technology, the third, fourth industrial revolution, and that helped along with working age population growth. Now we find working age population growth is going down, but also labor productivity growth is going up. And that is the main reason why in the whole world, GDP growth, I find over the next 10-15 years and over the last 10 years has been going down, as I show in my book, because labor productivity growth has going down. We need to reverse it through a new agricultural revolution, through new technology, but education, so that people can use that new technology. and new ways of working. So I argue in a number of papers, including in 2011 in a keynote speech for ADB in Japan to 40 odd Asian countries, that we need holistic solutions. Do not think about solutions for aging. Think about solutions for the whole population, which means we need labor reform, we need education reform, we need pension reform, we also need technology reform and tax reform. Holistic reform and structural reforms are needed. Who said this first? A very, very good contact and friend, and I refer to him as the hero of the world, because every country should do what he suggested. He's no longer there, but my hat's off to him. He's the former Prime Minister of Japan, and he articulated it in the third arrow, structural reforms. So every country needs structural reforms, because otherwise we are sticking to the structure of the older
Yeah.
days. So India and China need structural reform. So does Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Sweden. But the reforms we need are very different. The labor markets cannot be the labor markets of 60s, 70s, 80s. Work from home, if that's a norm, then we need to have tax laws to adapt to it. We need to have technology to adapt to it. We need to have other things to adapt to it. And therefore, we really need to work longer, learn longer as we live longer.
And I was thinking, if you look at the economics and central banks have played an important role, did they take demographics into account when doing their sort of trying to figure out what the neutral real interest rate was, or what's your take on what the central banks did for the last 10-15 years?
Thanks for asking that question. It's a pet thing of mine as a former teacher of monetary economics and a follower of central banking policies. The R star model of Holston Lovatt Williams, which is the benchmark model used by the Fed and nearly imitated by everybody in the world, left out in their earlier versions, as they said in the latest version, two very important things. Number one, globalization, and number two, demographics. Why? Because they did not think demographics was a thing which would change too much. They thought that the 70s would continue forever. But today, we are seeing the pyramids that you're talking about. We are seeing people retiring earlier than 65 if they've made enough money. We've seen a lot of people work beyond 65 because they don't have enough money. So we need to think about these structures out of nature, and we need to take demographics into consideration. So I'm very happy to say that the Fed, the BIS, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, etc., just Google them and type in the word demographics. And I will take a bit of credit for saying that in 2000, central banks should look at demographics, productivity, and technology in connection. It was a paper that Mr. Greenspan ordered in 2001, where we showed the only difference between US, Europe, and Japan was US had a much more dynamic labor force where the young and old contributed despite the technology being the same. So we definitely need to think about changing consumers, changing workers. And I'm happy to say that today Jay Powell talks about it with big data, looking at the differences between what you're doing today versus what you did 5 years ago.
And I was thinking, we talked before, and Larry Kotlikoff was a guest here previously, and he's been very adamant saying that, giving all the financing of all social structuring going forward, as you mentioned early on, going to be a struggle. So he said, if you take that into account, all countries are bankrupt, more or less. China, US, UK, Germany, because we cannot sustain this way. What is sort of your take on that? Are you as optimistic, or are you as pessimistic, or are you more
No,
optimistic?
I'm realistic. And these are things that even Henry Tapper and you and others have talked about in a lot of indirect ways. That the world we live in today, and I will refer to a paper I wrote, it's very, very challenging. It'll still be relevant 10 years later. It says to deal with pensions, you need changing mindsets, you need changing toolkits, and you need changing advocacy. And why? Because we are still using the tools of portfolio theory, which are single period models, and we are looking at multiple periods. We are still assuming yield curves which are going up when yield curves are close to zero or inverted. We are still assuming labor force which is growing and productivity which is increasing. All those assumptions really need to be changed as and when we get the data. And today, with big data, we get inflation data, daily estimates, monthly estimates. The Fed is using those kind of things. We have GDP growth with growth at risk from the IMF and the Fed, we really need to look at data much more carefully. And I do think that that is really, really key for us to think about fiscal sustainability. So I wrote a paper, two papers, challenging the European Commission, saying that you are nearly bankrupt, but you need to put in reforms on labor market, on pensions, tax codes, and the promises need to be renegotiated. No one says that the promises are ironclad. As long as we reform the promises, you can have conditional DB type schemes. You can have hybrid schemes, which are a mix of DB and DC. So no one said that DB is totally dead and DC is also not good. I would think that the middle path is much better than either DB or DC. And this was said by the person who invented DC. So, for the benefit of everyone in the audience, again, without calling out names, most people in UK get this wrong. Who invented DC schemes? One of the people was Modigliani, Franco Modigliani, and on his deathbed in the book Rethinking Pension Reform with Muralidhar, he said that hybrid pension schemes may be the way forward because DC does not provide the same kind of level of retirement or retirement income as DB did. DB overpromised, DC under delivers. So somewhere in between, with so many smart people, people from Now Pensions, Age Wave, Age Pensions, Cardano, etc., we should be able to develop better solutions.
I think that's an interesting topic because also in defined benefit, if you look what it costs, you probably save probably a third of your salary into such a system. And if you're in a DC system, well, you pay 8-10%. So it's a bit what you get, what you pay for as well. So I think when you compare it, one wasn't financially sustainable, and the other one, maybe we don't save enough to get a good solution. So I think it's also about how much you put into the system.
Exactly. In fact, in a paper written by, along with the former pensions minister, Lord Hunt, but it was promoted by Reddington, it's called The Age of Responsibility. I wrote the first chapter and I articulated we need to save somewhere close to 15%, even in richer countries, if we want to have the kind of living standards that people like Beveridge and others thought about in England while they were thinking about the welfare state, or like what the Swedish prime ministers, Olaf Palme, etc., thought about or was it Norwegian, made a speech saying we want a system whereby you get 70% at retirement or something like that.
Yeah. I think before we let the audience in, I want to ask you a couple of questions on how demographics impact asset prices. And if you go back to what you just said, you're saying we're going to see a yield curve that's sort of relatively flat. We don't get the yield we hope for. Growth might not be there. So looking for the next 10-15 years, what do you think demographic will do on asset prices? And keep in mind, these are people thinking about pensions. How can I sort of transform my saving into an income and earning a sort of return on the way?
So I will be a bit controversial and say central bankers, and I'm friends with central bankers and students of mine are central bankers, may have kind of overthought their prominence and power in affecting markets. Monetary policy is blunt and ineffective in an aging world, something that IMF and some people at the Fed and I have talked about. And therefore, we need fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural reforms to work in tandem. Monetary policy has been misplaced by keeping interest rates too low. If you keep interest rates too low, you misprice one productive um, um, factor of production. So let me explain it very, very simply. If you go back to Adam Smith or you go back to Ricardo, there are four factors of production: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. For land, you get rent. For labor, you get wages. For capital, you get interest rates. And for enterprise, you get, or risk taking, you get profits. I believe over the last 2 decades, the biggest problem has been marginal productivity of capital has not priced in with interest rates. So in equilibrium models, I think that has been broken largely through actions of the central bank. And maybe this bout of inflation will allow fiscal policy and monetary policy to come together again and come up with the right prices whereby we have interest rates which are in line with risk taking. So I can't borrow 100 100, let's say, euros from you and give you 95 euros good, but the last 5 euros in tatters, so that you have to go and you have to pay something to reach the central bank and get it. That's like a negative interest rate. For anything where I borrow from you for 5 years, it cannot be less than what the rate is for 1 year. And that's what I highlight in my book. That's what Sam Wilson and others who talked about life cycle savings talked about. So it is an absolute anathema to have interest rates which are inverted, interest rates close to zero. If that's the reality, we have to recheck that reality and ensure that we reach a model, if we have to use classical economics. Otherwise, throw out all the toolkit and say capital is not productive. Just like if interest rates are negative, do not have them in your asset allocation, because then bonds, you have corporate bonds which give you better, you have infrastructure bonds which give you better. Bonds, don't hold government bonds, hold them very minimally if they are not there. And this brings me to what do we do with asset allocation. In 2002 at an Allianz conference, I said, move away from pasta and pizza culture. That's the 60-40 culture of portfolio theory. That's absolutely rubbish, because that means that you hold equities and bonds 60-40. Now, why would you hold bonds 40% if those bonds are poisoning your food? So instead, you want to go towards Russian food, okay, could be real estate. Indian food could be infrastructure. Chinese food could be commodities. And alternatives could be American food. And you need to diversify and go towards alternatives, which include real assets, and real assets linked to infrastructure, linked to the growth of economy, linked to the growth of the world are good. And in that context, macro bonds are going to be very important. Schiller first talked about macro bonds linked to the growth and risk of the economy. And very recently, two of your and my friends have developed the selfie bonds, which they use in Brazil as part of risk diversification and giving a better pension income. Maybe solutions like that might
Yeah.
come.
So Amlan, we have a question also from a previous speaker, David John. And instead of me repeating the question for you, let's roll the tape.
Because of demographic changes and market situations, higher fluctuation, inflation, and the like, are we facing a situation where, like we had in the 1970s, where we had stagflation, where we actually had a negative rate of return over the decade in equities and high inflation on top of that?
It's a great question from David John. And I would like to kind of mention that that was caused by supply side shocks. Now, somebody said that I've not talked about inflation in detail. I teach courses on inflation for just one semester. So there are two elements to inflation. One is demand side, where excess demand by consumers relative to supply leads to inflation. Second is supply side inflation, where you find supply side shocks, whether oil shocks, worker shocks, commodity shocks, or supply chains causing inflation. Now, inflation, which is happening recently, we saw the signs for it, so did the central banks, but they did not take it very, very importantly. And they did not take it as seriously, thinking that it's just a blip. Now that we are seeing some of those supply chain shocks, those are also related to geopolitics, and demographics is linked to geopolitics. I want to refer to one of the biggest heroes of globalization and geopolitics, according to Kissinger. And this is a guy who wrote a book which predicted the Ukraine we are seeing today, which predicted 9/11, etc., and has a lot of demographics linked to geopolitics. The guru, according to Kissinger, on international relations. Read his book called Clash of Civilizations. Professor Emeritus Sam Huntington. He shows the Muslim youth bulge. He talks about India and China. He talks about Russia and Crimea. He talks about Ukraine. He talks about changing generations in America. And we really need to think about those things very, very carefully. So, yes, we are likely to see stagflation, but that stagflation is largely going to be related to geopolitics of the kind that we didn't see in the 70s. In 70s, it was mainly in US. These supply shocks are now post-COVID reverberating around more than 100 plus countries. So they are more dangerous because they are providing a more insular world of more regional blocks. So that's the supply shock example. And we see supply chains from China affecting Tokyo. I was there in Japan, and they are getting very, very badly affected in terms of what's coming from China, and so is Singapore. So we need to think about the unlevering those supply shocks, and diplomacy has a big role to play because it's beyond just finance. The second thing is GDP growth. For that, you need holistic reform, as I already talked about, to increase productivity growth. You need better education, you need better technology, and you need better integration of globalization. I am absolutely anti the concept of deglobalization. Globalization is occurring. I'll give you an example. Student of mine who was head of IMF in Zimbabwe told me that his gardener in Zimbabwe, a very poor person, owns stocks of Belgium, India, as well as Mexico. This does not tell you globalization is going down. Information liberalization, watching things on YouTube, as well as investing in stocks, etc., is the way globalization is happening. Just trade of goods and services has closed down. Movement of people somewhat may have closed down, but globalization is there to stay, and it is there to stay in a different way. So please do not call it deglobalization. Just say globalization has changed. There are four different parts of globalization: people, goods and services, information and financial are going by leaps and bounds.
Thank you, Amlan. That was a very good explanation to that, and I think it gives us some food for thoughts on what the future will look like, and definitely it's not going to be as easy as in the past. So let's turn to the audience and answer a couple of their questions. David has a question here. He says, you shared some examples of ways that companies and countries are dealing with an aging society. Are there any misguided actions that you see being made around the world or close to home?
I will be provocative, and I will refer all of you to a speech I gave at the British Property Federation before Brexit. Standing room, we had three illustrious gentlemen: Boris Johnson, Ken Livingstone, and Mr. Norris there. And I did say Brexit is going to be pain for both European Union and UK. And if the time was 2004, 2005, Brexit was good. But in the time of 2015, when I gave the speech just before Brexit occurred, but was being debated, I said it will end up in UK pound being 1.2 dollars to the pound. People laughed at me. So please do look at what I talked about in that paper, where I showed how different is Wales relative to Northern Ireland, relative to Scotland, relative to England. So today people call it leveling up. Please do go and look at that report. That's the granddaddy of leveling up. But no, people at that time didn't look at it, and now started looking at it when Mr. Johnson mentioned it. So yes, we did get Brexit, I will claim, a bit wrong, because the timing of it definitely is costing UK. Look at the strikes, look at the disgruntlement, and a society where growth is going down. There are a lot of global shocks of COVID. There's geopolitics of supply shocks, and you are feeling a lot of reverberations across US, China getting caught in the crossfires. It is not the right time to go into that blizzard or into that storm on a single boat when you were in a mega boat sitting with 28 different people.
Thank you, Amlan. Let's speak. There's a lot of questions I see, so let's be relatively quick. We only have like 15, 20 minutes left. So we have a question here from Paul. It says, live longer, work longer, learn longer. This seems to occur with understanding that the linear study, work, retire model is broken. Flexibility to study, work, and take time out at different times in the future seems to be required. Pension and savings frameworks therefore need to support this flexibility and assist in achieving financial independence. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Go and see the government of Singapore. So closer to home, people didn't pay attention. But in 2004, when I challenged the government of Singapore that people are retiring in the government at age 45, 46, and you have one of the highest longevity in the world, but also one of the lowest fertility in the world. So one of the most inverting age pyramids. How are you going to deal with it? What did they do? Their manpower planning department started retraining workers who wanted to retire in the 50s and tell them that if you don't retrain, we will not give you those free benefits that we were giving you. So retrain, find a job, and still keep working until as long as you can. And we need to have holistic frameworks. Absolutely correct, Paul. Pensions and savings, we cannot talk about pension solutions unless you talk about education, labor, consumer, and taxes. We cannot talk about savings without that either. So you hit the nail on the head, and hats off to you.
And actually, I'm gonna give Henry a comment on his question. It says, just listening to the speed of thought of Amlan, it makes me feel old. And that's a nice compliment, Amlan. And that means like, you can still do cool, good stuff and think quick. Age is just a factor, and 60 is the new 40s, I guess. Kevin has a question here as well. Building on Paul's idea, it has long seemed to me that the tax breaks on pension savings rest on just one criteria, being old, which feels inadequate. So any tax break should cover the other key aspects, training or retraining. So there should be some new super ISA slash pension beast, which allows payouts on account of age or retraining needs. Do you think governments will go for that?
Kevin, excellent question. Just like Paul, I give you 95 out of 100, both of you. But let me tell you the big problem that I didn't answer. In 2016, I was called to talk about in a US conference pre-election who will win. And the best forecaster in US and I, we both got it wrong by picking Hillary Clinton. And there somebody said, how come Medicare, Medicaid reform and all these kind of things aren't happening in America? So let me give you a truth about not having reforms. Old people above the age of 65, 73% of those vote in US. People between 25 to 34, roughly 30% vote. So the voting power is all with the gray haired old people. And please note the big difference. And this is also to my friend David John from AARP. The difference in 1970 to today is today the richest age group in the G10 is the 65 to 74-year old, because they have had a quadruple dividend of high equity markets, high bond markets, high real estate, and high GDP growth. So the stagflation today you see is going to affect the millennial generation, generation X, Y, and Z more than the older ones. So I do think we really need to recalibrate this and ask the question, are we being generationally fair? And that is another thing that we really need to take into account. Um, so I do think pay-as-you-go pension systems are not very relevant today. You need to reform them and have them as hybrid with some of the thoughts that Henry and Paul talked about. Amanda's got a question.
Yeah. So Amanda says, on working longer to get benefit like health insurance, what about people with other type of jobs, caring or manual jobs like driving ambulances, nurturing, teaching, driving buses, building houses, etc.? Working longer seems to work well for consultants and finance people. How do people in other professions stay in the workforce? Have you seen any good examples?
Excellent question. So here's an example, Amanda. Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines. People trying to retire earlier who are essentially security people in the governments. Okay, so they are security officers, administrative people in the government, but they want to retire earlier. So they are told, you try to learn some of the techniques which will be more useful in the private sector. So they are given Excel courses, they are given Word courses, and then they are also taught about how to look after the security of warehouses and factories, not just government installations. So, and this is paid for by the government. The quid pro quo is we will pay for you to retrain, but then you have to apply for those kind of jobs and not just be dependent or a burden of the government. Otherwise, what I'm talking about doesn't work, because people like Stefan, people like professors or CEOs, CIOs, they can always find their jobs and get onto boards. The blue collared workers need to find some kind of a work that they can do. They definitely can't do 50 hours of let's say, labor work, but they could do 20, 25 hours of driving work. Many of them are doing. I just went to India where I met somebody who's a 70-year-old driver in Kochi. I asked him where was he earlier. He said 35 years in Kuwait in construction. So there are people who are, because of necessity, will find ways to do it. But the labor market has got to be flexible to give them that opportunity. And the biggest opportunity we need to give is to our young people. I think my generation and older have been largely selfish, and we've not created enough opportunities for the younger generations. And the baby boomer generation needs to be more generous to the millennials, generation X, Y. And even if that means cutting some of our benefits so that we work longer and it goes meaningfully towards programs for the younger generation. Because today we have 5 generations living, of which in many cases only one generation is working. So look at the example I'm giving you. A 91-year-old from Ormskirk retired with a 66-year-old daughter in Liverpool. Real life example. 66-year-old daughter is a nurse. Her son is aged 44, who's got a 22-year-old daughter with 1-year-old twins. So 5 generations are existing. Who's going to pay for that? All the actuarial models are useless if they are just looking at 3 generations. We need to look at realistic models. If not, forget about models. Just look at 3 different scenarios and try to incorporate that.
But I think a good thing going to come out also when a lot of the baby boomer retires, a lot of jobs going to be opened up for the younger generation. So I think it's going to open a lot of opportunities for a lot of people as well.
Oh, great point.
And I think also if you can do another job when you're a bit older, being a driver or something else, I think that also makes you more part of a society, because just because you hit 65, you shouldn't just be put aside. You want to be part of society. And I think my gut feeling there is a bit like there is a bit of ageism in the society as well. And I think it's going to go away slightly because it's going to be a need for a lot of people. So there's going to be a demand. So maybe this sort of going to help it out a bit on itself.
Brilliant point. I'll give one example from Japan. The entrepreneurs in Japan are growing in 3 segments: women, young people, and third, older people who are setting up their own companies and allowing young people from their own neighborhoods to join. So they feel that they never got to be entrepreneurs earlier. Now there's nothing to lose. Let's be an entrepreneur, keep young people, and let's set up businesses. Yeah. And the young people can do all the technology, marketing, etc. These people can contribute a lot of their thought process and IP, etc. I do like the point that David raised: can monetary policy adequately address inflation in a globalized world? And the answer to that is no. We need fiscal policy along with monetary policy. Monetary policy spectacularly failed in keeping interest rates within the 2% boundary from 2000 till 2022. What has caused inflation and helped them achieve their target or go beyond? It's supply side shocks. So we really need to think about inflation being managed both by monetary as well as fiscal policy.
And there was a question up there from Kevin, and he says, which I think is a really good question. Do you think that demographic trends are fully reflected in asset valuations? Is there an opportunity to try to add value by sort of anticipating those trends when you do investing?
Okay, so Kevin, there was a Bloomberg index, there was a Credit Suisse index, and I've helped 3 of my largest asset manager clients in Credit Suisse create demographic funds. But the Bloomberg index that I created was based on 6 sectors, and it outperformed the MSCI ACWI index handsomely by 0.5 to 0.9% over the time that it was done. So yes, you could do it based on indices. So you choose sectors, within the sectors choose stocks. If you don't believe that, then choose one sector and use the best active fund managers within those stocks. You don't believe in that, you can still go alternatives and allow people who are going to give you alpha. Please don't forget the next speaker has changed the nature of pensions by turning pensions into a business, saying it's not about managing liabilities alone, it's about maximizing the assets relative to liabilities so that we run it as a business with people who understand about investments and yet want to deliver the best for pensions. And his name is Charles Lamoureux from OTPP.
Yes,
The next
Claude
speaker,
Lemre.
Claude Lamoureux.
Yeah. So I will give you a bit more hint on that towards the end, so you can sign up for that webinar. There's a question here from David. You mentioned immigration as key economic driver for low population growth countries. In Canada, we are seeing unintended consequences of sudden large immigration growth, which is a big contributor to our cost of housing crisis, which for seniors can have a big impact on aging in place capability and can diminish their children's ability to provide them financial support. So the point here is like if a lot of people come in with a lot of money, they're going to drive the housing market, and then the locals are going to have difficulties actually finding a house when you're old. Rent's going to go up. The children can't find it. So, what's your sort of take on that?
So, David, please take this offline, or you can go and look up an opening speech I gave at Canadian Security Traders Association in a place called Mont Tremblant. It's a ski resort in the summer. I gave it, I think, in 2015 or 2018. And there were only traders in that room. They were talking about block trading. But one of the key things that I talked about out there is Canada is a very, very big area. And there are different parts of Canada which can grow regionally very fast in different ways. So Canada also needs balanced growth. It's growing too fast in some places in Ontario, let's say in Toronto. It's growing very fast in some places in Quebec, etc. But it's a huge landmass, and given their resources, there can be a lot of big satellite towns, and people in a world where you're working from home can contribute very positively. And cost of housing crisis is not a very big issue in Canada. I also gave a talk on this at the real estate conference in Canada, opening it in 2019. Again, both these conferences, if you can look at my presentations there, I did show that Canadian population density is much lower than in other countries and even in the main cities. But managing immigration is very, very important. You may want to look at how different countries look at immigration differently. So there's a paper I looked at during the asylum seeker crisis in Europe called A Look Back at 400 Years of European Immigration, where I showed that Germany's immigration model is very different than France, than Italy. Similarly, Canada is very different than US. And I did refer to the US government to consult with you or the Australians, because on immigration policy, there are only two countries which passed my questions over the last 30 years. One is Canada, they get a C, and another is Australia, they get a C minus. Rest, every large country in the world fails my immigration fairness question, because you are not fair towards your own local residents. You always have to ask the question, why do we need immigrants? For how long? What's the cost? What's the benefit? Do we need short term? Do we need long term? Could we give them 3-year visas rather than 10-year visas? And every country needs to do it differently based on the skills available, based on the funding available. And therefore, I somewhat agree with your question, but Canada is way ahead of other countries in dealing with both the housing crisis and overall immigration.
We have a question here from Andrew. It says, we have an aging population for the last 100 years. We seem to have managed. What's different now?
The percentage of old people is different, and the 80 plus are the, Andrew, you are, please go and look at data. I'm a data geek, okay? So I appeal with you, please look at data. The 80 plus are the fastest growing population age group in the world, and they are growing roughly at 4 times the average population growth. And the 80 plus have a disproportionate share of the taxes. So in Europe, old age, disability, education, and health is accounting for 83% of the taxes in Europe. No country can afford also 23% of their GDP going on pensions, long-term care, and healthcare. This never did happen. So the 80 plus is what contributes the increase in debt in Japan. 91% can be explained by the increase in the 80 plus population. So it is very different. It is very urgent, and you never had 5 generations existing 100 years ago.
And this takes me to the last question here by Will. It's almost you think like we need to take urgency to solve the demographic problems. But Will bring up another question here. What do you think about the degrowth movement as a solution to the climate changes? Because that's another problem which also is long-term difficult to deal with. And there's a lot of people out there saying if we reduce growth in the world, we consume less, etc., then we will sort of be better off.
Yes, many people believe that population of 10 billion cannot be accommodated in the world. I don't think population is the problem. Population density is the biggest problem. 19 out of the 25 largest cities are which are mega cities, more than 25 million of population, are in emerging markets. They do not have time to think about climate change. They have time to think about survival. So you really need to teach them to grow in other smaller towns and cities. Otherwise, you will be, as I am telling you, in my own country, the top three most polluted cities in the world. Mumbai, population density of 46,000 people. Number two, Kolkata, population density 33,000 people per square kilometer. And then you've got Delhi. And these three basically mean that a child born in Mumbai or Delhi or Kolkata relative to a child born in London starts off with a -5 plus age life expectancy. So we really need to think about solutions of not just talking degrowth, but also north-south dialogue and talking about things in terms of an overall globally holistic, congenial thing where the emerging markets should be tried to be understood rather than just pushed back and saying that do not create so much pollution, because they are creating pollution. I hate it. And I will tell you, I'm coming from a city which is India's uh, um, most literate state, and they have a airport which is all green. They have a what do you call a city which is also 80% on electrical and hybrid vehicles. So, if given the right incentives and education, it could work, but it is likely to work much more in educated world rather than in poor developing world.
So, Amlan, you have taken your time to answer all our questions, and thank you everyone for bringing your questions in. Now you will have a chance to ask a question to our next guest, which is Claude Lamoureux, and he used to be the CEO of Ontario Teachers, and he transformed that from being basically buying local Ontario bonds into actually a modern investment house. So, what is your question to Claude?
First of all, congratulations, Cloud. You are the magician of pension funds. You've changed Ontario teachers from thinking about liabilities to thinking about liabilities and assets holistically without giving it a name LDI. You did very good ALM, grew the assets per liability, and created a success. I would like to know, what would your suggestion be to countries where you do not have the same kind of autonomy that was afforded to OTPP and CPP in Canada, where the government stood behind them? Oftentimes, we find in other countries you don't have the same kind of backing from the government. And secondly, you also had very, very well educated investment people on your boards all the time, treating pension funds as a business. What would your minimum criteria for financial literacy be as an advice to the UK government, as an advice to the US government?
Well, that was a good question, Amlan. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who attended today. I think it was a very interesting discussion around demographics and how that's going to impact our world. So I hope to see you next time with a discussion with Claude. And I would like to thank you, Amlan, for coming here and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. And let me end by saying none of us can do this alone. We need all of us to collaborate: government, private sector, public sector, young, old, all generations, so that we can enter what Aldous Huxley called a brave new world.
Thank you, everyone.